Now, we're moving on to another great leader, Elizabeth Littlefield, the CEO of OPIC. And the question I have for you, Elizabeth, is you have been a real leader in OPIC in extending its business in Africa, including Power Africa. You have a strong passion and a lot of experience on the continent. So what are your personal and institutional views on the outcomes of the FFD process, and what could be added now as we work through the implementation of the SDGs to actually deliver on private sector development and finance in Africa? Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Barbara, and good morning to everybody. You know, I was actually really pleased to hear at FFD so many of the leaders that made their speeches talking with the ardor of the converted about the private sector, which I hadn't really heard before, and that was something I thought was great in Addis. But I want to tell you a little bit what we're hearing from our clients, both on the developer, the businesses, and the governments. Because even though they're all talking about the private sector and the role of the private sector, I still perceive a really insidious and pervasive distrust of the private sector by governments. And I think there's a real split between the ministries of finance and the ministries of foreign affairs, who aren't really business people at their origin. But I see this distrust as being what's holding us back the most. And it's because we speak different languages, it's different cultures, we come from different places. Frankly, the only people that use the term private sector is the public sector. I was in the private sector my whole life. I never heard the term until I joined the public sector. So for, on the one hand, you have governments trying to, run their countries. On the other hand, you have business people that are trying to deploy capital and make money and hopefully do good at the same time. So I think it's a cultural issue. Anyway, so what we're hearing, and frankly, that becomes more and more acute as the private sector begins to take over those sectors that are traditionally played by governments. Education, we're seeing more and more private sector providers providing education, and that makes the Ministry of Education kind of defensive. You're seeing private sector players in health, and that makes the Ministry of Health kind of defensive, not to mention energy, et cetera. So what's really interesting is what we're hearing from the developers on the one hand and from the governments on the other. When you ask developers and investors what's their biggest concern, it's that it's not the macroeconomic or the regulatory or legal frameworks in Africa anymore. It used to be, but that's a small percentage of their concern. Their main concern over and over again, and there was a fascinating EIU study on this, is the lack of political will, of the sense of urgency, execution capability on the part of the governments. So that's interesting. So that they lack the ability and the risk-taking to make a decision and just get it done. This is particularly true on the energy front. When you flip over and ask the governments what their issues are, they are, like most governments everywhere, kind of frozen by the risk that they have to absorb to make a decision. There's no penalty for inaction if you're a government, right? So they tend to be concerned about the legacy of sweetheart deals, the difficulty of setting cost-covering tariffs, frankly, the past couple of examples of situations when developers did take advantage of information asymmetries. So they don't want to move. So you have the developers frustrated by the lack of movement and execution on the one hand, and the countries that have no real incentive to make decisions. And I think that is where the distrust manifests itself in not moving private investment forward. So, I'm happy to come back a little bit later and just talk a little bit about what we see, but frankly, even though this is happening, I think it's getting better, and as more and more successes are publicized and known, more and more governments are having private sector experience, and even though I've just talked about distrust for five seconds, I really do believe that we're seeing a real renaissance. Certainly we're seeing capital flows, doubling to 120 billion last year on the continent. Our portfolio, OPIC, which used to be in single digits just a couple of years ago, is now, with this year for the first time ever, will be 40% of our commitments on the continent will be on the continent this year. So anyway, I'm an optimist. I'm happy to talk about the two concrete things next time around.
Yeah. No, Elizabeth, I think if you were to talk to the two co-facilitators, the ambassadors leading the financing for development process, they will tell you this was a key struggle in negotiating the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And I think the answer, the solution, relates a lot to being more specific about blended finance, the deal structures, and the success stories, the kinds of things that David talked about. So I think it's really important, your point, and how we push forward, and I thank you for that.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.